Before we begin, there's actually something really important we need to discuss. Unfortunately, ad revenue has been some of the worst that I've seen in many years here on YouTube, to the point where we're not sustainable here on Shadiversity, and so your support now means more than ever. We've recently launched memberships here on Shadiversity, and so if you're willing to support any amount at all, $1 to $5, you can do that here on the YouTube memberships, also on Patreon, and we have an independent alternative, Subscribestar, as well as Utreon. I genuinely believe we're making some of the best content we ever have here on Shadiversity, but YouTube does not make it easy. We really are struggling, so every bit of support means the world. And if you're not in a position to be able to support, thank you for watching these videos. Please share, like, subscribe, all those things help, commenting as well. And to everyone who is supporting us, thank you so much. It means the world.
Shadiversity.
Greetings, I am Shad, and there is no such thing as the best sword in the world. You hear that said a lot? I've said it a lot. But is it actually true? Now, to add a bit more context, usually when people say that, me included, we're kind of referring to there's no such thing of a sword that can do absolutely everything in every single category of what a sword needs to do better than all other swords, where it can cut better than all other swords, as well as thrusting as well as all other swords, as well as being able to block, deflect, have the lowest weight, everything. There's such a give and take in sword design where if you really want a sword emphasized to thrust, you usually reduce its cutting capacity. So that is completely true. I'm not challenging that notion, but what I want to propose to you is the idea of, okay, yes, we understand that there's no sword that can do absolutely everything better than any other sword, but is there a sword that can do most things particularly well, that on balance, it's the most versatile sword and capable sword and functional in the most range of categories than other swords? You might know where I'm going with this because I am holding a longsword. There is a reason why I love the longsword, and it's my favorite sword. It has its limitations depending on design, because longsword designs can vary quite significantly. If we just have a look at this Alexandria sword versus the Lockwood one that I've had for a good while. And that's not the only differences. You have long swords that have, more parallel edges, stronger, fuller, weight distribution different, and so you can get wildly different performance out of different long swords. To me, that's actually a strength with the category because it shows the versatility in what you're able to achieve while still keeping the primary design parameters the same. It's a cruciform sword, double-edged, has a cross guard, two-handed, and by staying within those parameters, huge versatility. There are so many threats online, and they're only getting worse. Surfshark's virtual private network adds a necessary layer of security. For instance, have you ever connected to a public Wi-Fi? Have you ever sent or received files online? Do you use online banking? Do you access foreign websites or streaming content? By masking your IP address, a virtual private network adds such an important layer of security for every one of those actions. It's through your IP address that nefarious people and viruses are able to track your location. If you want proper privacy and security, a VPN like Surfshark is brilliant. Remember though, a VPN is not virus protection, but it is more like privacy protection. And it's through getting access to your data that some of the worst things can happen online. Here at Shadiversity, we have many important accounts on many websites like YouTube that if someone was able to get private information regarding those things, it could ruin our livelihood and business. There are so many threats online. VPN adds another layer of security. I highly recommend it, and Surfshark is brilliant and it has this awesome deal for you. All you need to do is go to surfshark.deals/Shadiversity and enter promo code Shadiversity for an extra 3 months free. There is a link in the description. If you don't have a VPN, I highly recommend it for that added security and the benefits associated. And Surfshark is one of the best. Remember, promo code Shadiversity for an extra 3 months, and thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. There's inherent advantages that a double-edged sword, a double-edged cruciform sword like a longsword, doesn't get that single-edged swords like the Katana or Kriegsmesser can take advantage of. I have a short explaining two really significant ones in regards to its edge angle and rigidity. That basically you're able to really take advantage of thanks to the core geometry of it being single-edged. It's not to say double-edged swords can't cut as well as single-edged swords, but there is this give and take that if you want to reduce, the width, the actual depth, this plane of it, you're reducing its rigidity, which can make it more difficult to cut, but that is skill. It's a skill issue. If you train yourself to be able to have really great edge alignment, even with thinner, more flexible swords, which long swords tend to usually be, you can cut devastatingly well. This is why my wording with that katana short was very specific, where I said they are perceived as being better cutting swords, not because they actually can make deeper, more devastating cuts than other swords, but it's easier to make those deeper, devastating cuts usually with single-edged swords like that than thinner, more flexible swords. But thinner, more flexible swords can absolutely cut just as deep and devastating if you just train and know how to do it really well. There are other, of course, really core advantages of having a double-edged sword that single-edged swords don't have. For instance, being able to strike with the back edge is something that is so significant that I have a dedicated video on that might be out before or after this one, where we actually go into the biomechanics of how significant that advantage really is. That's something that you don't get with that, and I love that level of versatility. And because you can, I guess, compensate for potential lack of cutting power in thinner, more flexible swords, that actually puts some more advantages in the longsword area, in my opinion. Personal preference, you'll like what you did, and if you don't, love the striking with the back edge, like as much as I do, that can go into, I guess, your analysis. But I do believe when we look at most of the things that a sword can do, the longsword, personally, ends up being one of the most versatile swords that you can get, where it can still do most things that you want a sword to do quite well enough. Where there are some swords that simply, like for instance, you look at falchions, their thrusting capacity is there, but just does not compare. Some swords just have such low thrusting capacity that you don't even bother with it too much. There are other things that, you can compare, because this analysis isn't just double edge versus single edge, it's also size differences. It's two-handed. This one, I guess, is personal preference, but I do feel the pros and cons almost become equivalent when you look at it, because I have done training with sword and shield and longsword, and I find this extra speed and leverage that you get out of two hands on a sword to be more advantageous at times than even using a shield, so long as you're not facing arrow fire, granted. But I've performed equally well with a longsword against sword and shield in many different situations than compared to when I do use a shield. Again, personal preference, but I think these advantages actually are quite significant. The extra reach oftentimes is a massive advantage against, one-handed swords. But also, what about larger swords? Because you're not going to be able to cut nearly as well with a really well-made war sword or great sword, okay? And the reach that you have with a great sword is huge. So I'm not saying a longsword is better at that, but it's the give and take, because one of the reasons why the longsword was preferred over much larger swords in personal self-defense is that they're still very convenient to carry. And it's not to say they don't get in the way or cumbersome. There is a level of awkwardness that you have when because they are on the bigger end, but it's like people naturally found one of the biggest ends of swords that still was easily convenient enough for most everyday carry, where something the size of a war sword or greatsword was going too far. And also, with it still being smaller, it can still do so many things that you want in terms of combat. The other massive advantage that you need to weigh up in this analysis between larger swords that usually will have greater reach, leverage, and cutting capacity is speed, though. With a shorter sword, you can get much faster cuts and be much more nimble in, say, a duel scenario, to the point where that additional speed, I'm not saying it overcomes the disadvantage that you say would have with reach if someone's using a really long sword against you, like a greatsword, but there's still an advantage there that the greatsword doesn't have. And when you compare it or try and balance it with all these other factors that you want to consider, like its wearability, how cumbersome it is to take with you, with how well it does in the cut and the thrust, we're finding that the longsword is so versatile, it can still do so many things that you would want a sword to do, where it disadvantages where it can't perform as well as, say, some other swords is balanced out by the fact that it can do so many other things better than, say, those swords can't do. It's the same thing when you, say, compare a sword to an axe, okay? This longsword cannot cut better than an axe, and it can't thrust better than a spear. But you know what it can do? It can thrust way better than an axe. An axe can't thrust at all, and it can cut way better than a spear. And so that's just an advantage for swords generally, where they are so versatile and then functional and convenient that they often became the favorite in history in regards to self-defense, what you took with you in your everyday. And so this versatility thing is important to understand then when we just try and compare swords to other swords. Because something else that long swords are really, really useful and good at, and sometimes excel much better than a lot of other swords, while not losing out in terms of disadvantages that it might get for being able to be functional in this other range, is against armor. Swords generally are not good at armor, period. They're not going to cut through metal. But long swords are actually usually better against armor than many other types of swords because they can usually be more narrow. They can half sword. You can half sword with other swords, but with the crossguard, okay, you can actually do murder strokes and really drive it into the gaps. And so it is generally understood that a longsword is actually a much better sword in trying to combat armor than a katana, or Kriegsmesser, or Falchion even, where on balance, the longsword, in my opinion, is actually the most versatile, usable sword in the world. It's not necessarily the best at everything, but it is good enough in most things where other swords don't have such versatility and range. And that's actually why, in my opinion, I do think longsword is the best sword in the world. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. It could cause much debate, this subject, but I do look forward to reading them, and I thank you for hearing me out in this video. I appreciate you for watching. Hope to see you in the next video here on Shadowversity. So until that time, farewell.